Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our Designing an Effective Catch-Up Curriculum webinar. I'm hosting this webinar today on behalf of Zen Educate, an ethical alternative to traditional recruitment agencies, social enterprise and Crown Services supplier. So today we're welcoming colleagues from across the UK. The format will be brief introductions to the panel, followed by each panel member responding to our initial questions, sharing insights and knowledge from their area of expertise. Then we'll take some questions. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box. We may not get through them all, but we'll do our best. If you have general questions or comments about the session or follow-up, please add those in the chat box. And if you'd like us to know where you're joining from today, it's always really lovely to know who's here. Do tell us that in the chat box too. So let me introduce our panel for you today. We have Mike Tonge, Janet Carroll and Alex Keane, and you're all very welcome. Thank you for being on our panel today. Mike is the CEO for Prestolee Multi Academy Trust and a member of the Executive Steering Group for Greater Manchester Learning Partnership. Prestolee has a teaching school and a skip within the Trust and 5 primary schools. Janet Carroll is a Senior Curriculum Advisor at Cornerstones Education, a leading primary curriculum company based in South Yorkshire. She has over 15 years of teaching experience, including 9 as a deputy head and a literacy lead in South London. And she's currently co-chair of governors in a London primary school. Alex Keane is the head of school at Prestolee Primary School, an outstanding primary school in Radcliffe, Manchester. And Alex has over 10 years experience working in primary schools and has supported improvement in schools across the Northwest as a specialist leader of education. And she's the curriculum lead for Prestolee Trust. So this webinar aims to cut through the uncertainty, sharing ideas and strategies and advice on meaningful recovery planning. We'll be exploring sensible approaches to supporting effective catch-up, how to use your curriculum, as well as discussing how we can ensure that all children's needs are met. So I'm going to start by handing over to Mike. And Mike, your leading question here is about the new education inspection framework and how we should be doing things differently.
Okay, let me just throw in a contextualization first of all. If you imagine that you are traveling from Manchester to Birmingham, let's say it's at night, so there's no other traffic on the road, and you travel at 60 miles an hour, and you set up at the same time, you'll more or less arrive at the same time. Currently, you've been parked at the service station between Manchester and Birmingham for about 18 months now. And the question is, how do we make sure that we actually arrive in Birmingham at the same time? So in terms of what acceleration looks like and how you move that additional learning forward, that catch-up, the view from the inspection framework would be very much around what is it your intelligent curriculum design says you should be doing. So in terms of what would be success for you. Now, the word I would use constantly is about deliberate. We've all gone through some very complex changes in our curriculum and children have had lots of different experiences. But what really matters from the new inspection framework is that you're very clear about your starting point and you're very clear about what success looks like to you and that you have designed intelligently your curriculum from A to B with added value. Now, that added value might be saying we're going to narrow aspects of what we're doing, and we're going to focus on gap analysis and filling those gaps. But what you mustn't do, absolutely mustn't do, is to start building your curriculum around an accountability framework that's focused entirely on maths and English, because there's a whole series of skills development that you need to concentrate on. And that is a full, wide curriculum or offer. So we don't expect to see any narrowing of the curriculum. Our expectation would be that the curriculum is wide, is rich, is engaged. But based on your thorough analysis of how children come back, you should be thinking very carefully about what are the hard skills that we need to learn, i.e. Filling the gaps in maths, in English, in SPAG, in sentence structure and so on. But also, what are the soft skills around learning as independent learners, interdependent learners, engaged learners? How are we making sure that a rich curriculum offer is focused on the things that we need to do? So if you're looking at history or geography, what are the things that are most important to you as a school? So it's really important to walk into an inspection confident that you've thought through that really carefully and that you as a school have defined your endpoints, given your starting points, and it's been thought through really clearly, and you've got a very clear progression map. And that might look differently for early years to year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, year 5, year 6 going into transition. But what matters is that you do not narrow the curriculum, you're clear on the challenges that you face, you're clear on your endpoints, and you're clear on what progression and accelerated progression looks like and what you're doing to add value to that. Maybe tutoring, maybe a digital strategy, maybe additional time outside of the school day. But you must be clear on it and you must be confident in expressing it.
So, sorry, I thought somebody else was going to jump in there. I felt like I was cutting across somebody. So Mike, with regard to the new inspections that we're going to be seeing, because I know you are an ordinary lead Ofsted inspector, but I also understand that you're not here speaking for Ofsted. So I'm going to make that distinction really clear for you. And you've made it really clear that the curriculum should not be narrowed. And you've also made it really clear that we need to be looking at how we can get some acceleration in place. What are the particular things that schools can be doing to support children to really build on individual strengths within that curriculum?
I think it's been really clear that actually children are not coming back less clever than when they left. What they've got is a particular set of skills that they have missed. Now, what we'd be looking for is each school to have a thorough evaluation of what's been missed, because actually a large number of schools have been in a large number of children have been in school. A large number of children have had a very successful digital strategy. A large number of children have had very successful live lessons. What you will see is lots of different strands. So what we would be looking for really specifically is that children have been analysed on entry and that they've got a very clear narrative around what has been missed, what's not been missed, because actually a lot of things won't have been missed. What we're not looking for is people going straight to a basic skills strategy of maths and English. We'll definitely be looking for an analysis of gaps, how you build up those things that you would call mechanical skill set, automatic recall, the ability to write in sentences, but also those soft skills about how you would develop stamina for writing, how you develop prolonged periods of concentration, how you would move away from a Q&A based teaching model into a more interdependent teaching model that children can work on a prolonged period of time on differentiated tasks. So what you're seeing in the pandemic is a lot of linear teaching. So you'll have a live lesson, which is about something that can be delivered mechanically. I can do maths, I can do SPAG. But what you're not seeing in those live lessons particularly is a complicated approach to teaching and learning, i.e. we're going to do 5 different approaches to problem solving in the next hour, which will lead us to a more complex problem solving. So you'll be looking for 2 separate strands. The first strand will be around what are you doing for more able children in particular who will not have had the extended opportunities that other children will have had, what you're doing about your more able disadvantaged, what you're doing about disadvantaged children, and what you're doing about filling in those gaps. But also the second strand is about how good is your analysis of the gaps and how plotted are the journey for children from A to B. How have you done that?
That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to move us on to our next question. And you've kind of started leading into this really already. How can we work supportively with parents, many of whom have received lots of negative messaging about lost generations, damaged cohorts, lost learning, lots of media stories about this and some really negative messaging. How can we support parents at this, with this?
I think my first answer to that is education's a bit like the NHS. Everybody knows a terrible story that one of their friends has been through, and everyone knows how terrible it is. But actually, at point of contact, 90% of parents have had really good experiences with their schools, and they've had a really good experience through live lessons. So I think whilst there may be a media perception that parents are very concerned about the quality of education that's been provided by schools, schools have done a really good job during the pandemic, and I think most parents recognise that. I think one of the challenges around it have been that the curtain has been lifted a lot on what we do in schools, that parents have been present during many of the live lessons, they've seen a very stripped down basic understanding of what teaching is because of the nature of the linearity of straightforward live lessons, which by their very nature has been question and answer, question and answer, question and answer. So in terms of building that confidence up with parents, we must first of all start to express what we were unable to do during the pandemic, the complexity of learning. We must be expressing those skills around with parents, how much work that has gone on that we are unable to replicate. And I think that constant positive reaffirming message that comes from us is going to be absolutely fundamental to that. I think the other aspect that we should definitely be thinking about in terms of where we go with the parents is that, we should first of all recognize what parents have been through. We should recognize the limitations and the strains that we have placed on parents through the pandemic. We should understand the difficulties that they have had, and we should definitely be sympathetic, but we shouldn't over sympathize with them. Actually, this needs some hard edge messages around, actually, we did our very best during that time, but now we're back in school. This is what complex learning looks like. And one of the things that the inspectorate, I think, are focused on at the moment, and I'd ask all schools to be really concerned about, is the difference between activity and impact. Activity versus impact. So you could have 80 parents at a curriculum evening talking about the new revised curriculum that you're going to do post-pandemic. And if parents then don't support with that and don't improve the work with that, then actually they're not making any difference. So you can have a whole evening with 80 parents, makes no difference. Actually, we should be targeting specifically with parents, the parents we need to work with, and work with those parents from step to step to step. So it's first of all, in terms of its analysis, more than anything, it's about being really clear, really consistent with your messaging, really positive, but also being really clear about what you can't do outside of school, what you must do in school. So it is this notion of you need children to be present, you need them to understand progression, and you need them to be active participants. Now, what happens during the pandemic is that parents have been passive participants in many cases because they've sat there during the live lessons because we've not been able to engage with them in that way. So it's about making sure that parents actively engage and understand where we're at and where we're going with that, because that's part of the complexity of it. But being positive, relentlessly positive with parents, but thinking not about activity, but engagement and impact, and how you would judge that. What improvement with parents would look like going forward, because parents have a very, just because they've been to school, they'll have a view of what school is, and we need to change that perception. They have seen some very straightforward accountability framework teaching. We need to change their perception about what a wider curriculum is, and we need to have them along as active participants, not passive passengers.
Okay, Mike, that's just so helpful, and there were some really clear key messages in there. I really like the point about, actually, by all means, let's be empathic, let's sympathise with what's been going on, but actually don't let's go so far down the route of what Kim Scott calls ruinous empathy. Don't let's be so caring that actually we forget about the challenge and we forget about actually wanting to progress things. And I really like your distinction as well about activity versus impact. Because it's really easy to get kind of involved in hectic activity and the impact diminish, really.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things I'd say about, early years is a really good example of it, where you go and you talk to early years and say, we've got an open door policy. We have a day when parents come in. We have a day when parents come and read with their children. So has it improved reading? No. Well, what's the point of it then?
Yeah. And your question is well placed. And it's a question I can remember an Ofsted inspector asking me in early years, actually, after I'd, worked really hard telling her about all the amazing things we were doing. And this very steely woman looked at me and said, so what?
And that's the question.
And that is the question. Yeah, that is absolutely the question. It was a good learning experience. Okay, Mike, thank you. I'm going to move us on to Alex. And Alex, I'm going to be, here's the first question really. How can we use assessment to ensure we're building on existing knowledge and understanding for each and every child?
Okay, so I think building on from what Mike said really, that there's been a range of experiences out there which children have faced. I think that we can sometimes presume what we think they will or will not know, but assessment is key, and knowing those starting points when children returned from the pandemic, which I know every leader and every teacher would have been trying to identify what would have been learned from the remote education that was provided, but the range of engagement within that made it quite difficult to presume what children had or hadn't learned. But there was that balance between actually, you know, giving lots of summative assessments, lots of tests as soon as children were returning was also not the right approach, considering everything that the children have been through and the pressure that can put on children. So when we think about this, we need to think about a sustainable approach to assessment. We need to identify those starting points for children. And assessment, you know, within lessons can do that. Low stake assessments can identify what children know and don't know. So there's lots of talk about using low stake assessments, whether it be through multiple choice questions, which provide variations of answers that you can identify the meaning of, but also that allow the teachers to address misconceptions. Misconceptions are key when it comes to assessment, especially with the perhaps linear approach that teachers took to providing live lessons and disseminating knowledge in that way of sort of, I'm telling you this knowledge and imparting it, where in the classroom we can ask questions more, so it's interactive, we can pick up on misconceptions. I think that the multiple choice sort of low stake assessments at the beginning of lessons across the curriculum will help to establish that starting point and be able to identify those misconceptions so that then you can plan effectively for that. You know, we've got to remember that assessment has got to be sustainable for everybody. It's massive in terms of workload for teachers, and there's a lot of talk about the workload challenge, and we, you know, we've got to make the data work for us. So it's got to be something that you can feed back into your planning. It's got to be that we use assessment to probe that learning and find out what children know, not how they perform. So learning is about what has actually been learned, obviously what's been taught, what's been learned, do they know it, and what's next, rather than this level of performance. So they, you know, obviously summative assessments give you that data that tell you at a point in time the performance of that child, and actually they don't always perform well on an assessment, but it doesn't mean that they don't know the learning, especially if we probe it. And I think that we've got to activate that prior knowledge. There's a lot of content from, you know, years before, lessons before, that we need to check is there. And actually we need to activate that, not just presume that it's there and carry on teaching new. So, you know, a really good part of the lesson is about activating prior knowledge so that you can build that schemata and identify what is there, know the starting point and build on that. So I do think a good lesson, good teachers will use assessment effectively within the classroom to identify the starting point, activate the prior knowledge, building new learning, and then they've got that job of checking that it actually is there. And I think when we think about assessment across the curriculum, we've got to think about what is the best way that that pupils can demonstrate what they know in that particular subject. So how we assess in PE and music will be different to how we assess their ability to recall the mathematics knowledge that they've been taught. And I think we've really got to recognise the subject and how they're unique to be able to actually think, how are we going to check what learning has taken place, what's missing, and how we build on that prior knowledge.
Alex, that's very helpful. Will you just spell out the distinction for us between you've used the phrase low stakes assessment several times. What's low stakes assessment, and therefore what would high stakes assessment be? Just tell us the difference between those two things.
Yeah, I think, well, low stakes, it should feel less threatening. It should allow the children to feel safe in that environment, to be able to reason with their responses. So I think low stakes would be, you don't expect them to pull out of thin air the answer to a question. It might be that you're providing multiple choice, like I said, answers, yeah, where actually you've got to look at, and they should be very similar in that respect, but you can look at them and identify the knowledge that you need from them by you know, looking at the difference and the variations, but also working together with children in the classroom, your partners, your friends, the person sitting next to you, to again activate your prior knowledge. Assessment, you know, everything shouldn't be a test and a quiz in that respect, and sometimes it takes one word and you remember something, don't you? And I think that's the low stake, and I think high stake assessments are more of those summative assessments under test conditions, no support, no engagement with others, and I think that's where we're checking performance. We are checking what's been learned, but that I think is more about a performance check for a point in time in that journey.
Okay, so low stakes assessment could include dialogue. It could include exploration, discovery, reasoning, a kind of Socratic questioning approach to gaining an understanding of what children are able to remember and reactivate and apply.
Yes.
Got it. That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move us on again. Really big question at the moment, because reading, it just is so fundamental to all of our education. And I think there will be some children, particularly early years children, who we're looking at needing to really pick up with their reading. So what does the evidence tell us about effective approaches to teaching reading? And I'm mindful of Mike's comments earlier about activity and impact. So what do we know about really effective approaches to teaching reading?
I think there's been a lot of research recently, and again, the new inspection framework draws upon this about that love of reading, and actually instilling that love of reading and how schools do that within the classroom. A lot of the research says if children are engaged emotionally with reading, that they make that connection to a book, to a story, to a character, that actually engages them in that process to begin with. There's been a lot of research around social motivation and how reading should be a social activity, not something that's to be done alone. So, in our school, we've looked really carefully at how we communicate about books from the teacher to the child, but also within pupil to pupil, having that ability to talk about books, to share funny parts, sad parts, things you like, things you don't, be able to vote which books you want to read and be able to recommend books to children is really key. And I think that does make it effective, because actually we want children to be lifelong learners for reading. Absolutely, there are systematic aspects of learning to read. There is that building of that word recognition, etc., and all of the phonics aspects and technical aspects of reading. But ultimately, we want children to be readers and lifelong readers and love that reading. So we need to look carefully at how you build that reading for pleasure within there. And the teachers are key in that, and their knowledge of children's literature is key. Knowing the children in your class and their interests means that you can then recommend books for children if you know their interests. We often think about what we would want the literacy spine in a school to look like and base it on the context of the school. But actually there's that role when you've got 30 children in front of you, where you've got to know what their interests are so that you can find that right book. They'll always say, you've just not found the right book yet. But actually, do we stop and ask children, what are they interested in? What are their aspirations for their future? To be able to identify books that they might connect with, especially children who are disadvantaged. I think that, they might not have reams of books related to their interest in their home. And I think that we've really got to invest in that in the classroom more, and this process of obviously reading out loud to children and all of those aspects of reading are definitely taking a shift, I think, and that's what's showing it is really effective. We've got to know their reading practices as well. I think that if we understood, or if they understood themselves as a reader, what they do like to read, what they don't, what actual pieces of reading they do throughout a day, and they understand each other's reading practices in a classroom, that will help make it that social status within the reading. And I think that emotional engagement will come from that, because actually that's what we thrive from, human connection and connectivity. And I think that the research, that's why it's gone down this route of promoting that love of reading more in especially in primary schools. Obviously, there's the place of purposeful talk and oracy development, very much focus on vocabulary, which again, going back to what Mike said with the curriculum, you learn vocabulary from across the curriculum. So to be able to engage with reading and books, and whether it be non-fiction, fiction books, you've got to have a good vocabulary base. So we've got to place vocabulary development across the curriculum at the heart of everything we do. And make sure that we're talking about talking about books and actually developing our spoken language to be able to then use that as good readers. again, when we think about phonics and we think about moving from phonics, from fluent and developing fluency with word recognition and building the language comprehension, it's really important to see that the bridge between reading and word recognition and building language comprehension is key. Again, in primary schools, I think we do a really great job of teaching children phonics and learning that code and being able to decode and to build the fluency with that. But that bridge from, you know, year one, when they've, you know, mastered phonics and they're working towards building language comprehension, it's how we do that and knowing the importance of fluency in that process. So we teach phonics and it develops the fluency, but then we stop teaching the phonics and start teaching comprehension and start doing guided reading, where actually they still need to hear fluent reading. They need to, that needs to be modeled to them. They need to be able to build their fluency and pace. So they're thinking about how they stress and their volume and intonation when they're reading. And we've still got to build that into the curriculum, that practice, because actually if you stop reading and you're just listening to reading, or you're just taking part in small sections of reading, you'll lose the fluency, you'll lose that ability to make connections with comprehension because you're not as fluent with your reading. And that's what we often find. So I would say we've got to make sure that what's really effective is that we are building love of reading. We are making sure that we're teaching phonics and decoding, etc. But we've got to make sure that we teach fluency beyond phonics so that children have the ability to bridge that gap to develop that language comprehension we want. And again, all of those things help the children become a skilled reader who loves reading and is ready for a life of reading.
Thank you, Alex. That's really helpful. You've given us lots of great pointers there. I'm going to move us on to Janet. So Janet, oh, sorry, I'm going to move us on. We're going to move us on to Janet. Sorry, I'm going to have to, yeah, in the interest of time, sorry. Janet, can you tell us, sorry, I'm just getting the right slide.
That's the one.
How can we plan to meet the needs of the most disadvantaged children? Because we know that some children have experienced multiple disadvantage during the pandemic, and those are the children that are going to be struggling the most unless we properly support them.
Yeah, well, I thought I'd address this question, not so much from the pandemic, but really sort of from lots of different angles of my experience, really. But firstly, starting with my own experience, so I started thinking about what is disadvantaged. And I thought about my own life, and I actually would officially, I think, be a disadvantaged child if I'd, was a child today. I grew up on a local council estate in South Manchester. Parents, my dad was an undiagnosed dyslexic, couldn't read or write, worked for the local council. My mum was a part-time dinner lady. So I would have been a PP child, I think, if I'd have been a child today. And yet I ended up getting a university degree. I ended up a deputy head teacher of a primary school. So I clearly overcame some disadvantage. That got me thinking about, perhaps why I was drawn to teach in a school in a South London council estate where there was lots and lots of disadvantage. So the most common sort of definition nowadays, I think, when we talk about identifying disadvantaged children is often that label of PP, isn't it? Pupil premium over 6, all that kind of thing. But in my school, where for those statistics, for example, most of the time we were somewhere between 48% and 55% children officially identified as PP, so a very socio-economic disadvantaged area. We recognised, my head and I, we undertook a sort of another disadvantage, and we recognised our children had more than just that label of PP that gave them a disadvantage in learning. We knew there were barriers to their learning. So we started to look at the different kinds of disadvantages they were facing. And obviously, in lots of cases, they were enormous. So we had parents, in prison, we had parents, that had domestic violence issues, parents in the police, children in and out of child in need plans, and sometimes on the verge, those children on the cusp of those social sort of structures where they've not quite got the support they need, but we knew that was affecting their day-to-day ability to learn. And you had children who were carers for others, who had disabled siblings at home. So we started to look at that bigger lens of disadvantage, and it made us consider, how that affected their ability to learn. And another example, I know we've mentioned parents a lot. In our example, about 70% of our parents didn't have any kind of qualification at all. So for them, that educational experience, like Mike and Alex have referred to, brings them to school with a different kind of mindset potentially in terms of supporting what school does. So we were battling all of that. So we undertook a bit of a strange exercise. I don't know whether schools out there want to consider doing it, but we decided we'd look at the children that had no known need or disadvantage in our, how were they doing? And because we felt our teaching was great, but clearly we were struggling with attainment at that time, struggling with progress for lots of our children. And we recognised these barriers with disadvantage. But we decided to look at the children that had, we called them nook nods. It sounds really weird, but it was no known need or disadvantage. They had none of those things going on in their lives. And actually, interestingly, out of a cohort of about 260 children, we found about 25 that didn't have any need, and they were doing really well. Their progress and attainment, they're above or at, they were doing really well. So we were quite confident that our teaching was doing well, but we realised we needed to really hone in on how we delivered to the majority of our children who were disadvantaged as well. And that led us to kind of reaching 4 sort of key areas that we focused in on. The first one, and I suppose for me, my experience of coming out of disadvantage, if you like, was I happened to live in a borough in Manchester that had grammar schools. And at the time, local children went to local grammar schools. I won't get into the politics of that. But I went to a local grammar school, and that opened my eyes to a whole different world of my new friends, their brothers, older brothers and sisters were going to university. What was that? They were traveling the world. So for me, opening my eyes to potential aspirational things that I'd not experienced before made me consider how school could help me get out of that, move towards that kind of life. And my parents were very supportive. So that also, I think, and we all know it's a massive part, research shows there's probably no greater indicator, I think, of the support that parental support can have. It's a massive impact on disadvantaged children if you can get them on board. So we went for a curriculum approach, a plan for high expectations, because we wanted to raise aspirations. So expecting them to do well, regardless of their disadvantage, and therefore opening their eyes to possibilities of where they could go. We then focused very much on learning behaviours and the language of learning. So the children were using the term, I'm, learning, you're interrupting my learning. Those kinds of languages that help everyone focus on why school is happening, why we come to school every day. Again, because of the disadvantages that was going on in their lives, we needed a curriculum and a school approach that focused very much on nurture, on making sure we were there to support their emotional difficulties. Obviously we had lots of ELSA support, lots of emotional literacy support, but a PSHE at the heart of everything we did as well, teaching children about those social behaviours, about, and having a restorative justice system in terms of our, dealing with discipline, so that there was forgiveness, that there was, lots of support around that emotional aspect of why, school can be difficult to deal with if you've, had a difficult time in class, and all those things that build on, making sure children come back to learning positively. So nurture was a massive part of planning for those disadvantaged children, making sure that there was all that support there for them. We had breakout rooms, places they could go to be safe and come back to learning when they were ready to learn. So recognising that, there are things that impact on your daily mindset that can prevent you from learning. And that might be something often that's gone on at home and nothing to do with school. And school needs to be like an oasis of calm for those children. It has to be structured. It has to be, consistent. All of those things need to be around for it to be successful. And then again, we've mentioned parents a lot. So parental relationships really important. So we devised activities like you can see on the screen there that got parents and the community and children involved in sharing their learning in a way that was creative and practical, because parents who don't have a positive experience at school don't want to come and look at your marking in a book, but they're quite happy to talk to their child about a robot they've built. The child explains how circuits work, because that's a less threatening, as Alex has mentioned, that low stakes conversation with a teacher in the room about a practical piece of learning, much more accessible for parents. So drawing those parents in and helping them to understand the learning that's going on in a way that's accessible to them as well as for their child, really important. So yeah, all of those elements, high expectations, building positive learning behaviours and a culture of nurture, alongside pulling in those parents, really important for making sure that disadvantaged children can overcome all of the things that they bring to school that an advantaged child doesn't necessarily. And again, rich text, I think Alex already touched on that. The fact is that those children that are disadvantaged don't come to school with that background of nursery or the understanding of structure of story. They haven't necessarily heard oral stories. So all of that has to be built in. We have to plug those massive gaps in terms of cultural experiences as well as learning experiences as well.
Okay, that's helpful. And actually, you know, you one of the things you're telling us is you did a lot of, you looked at the data very carefully. Actually, you were very careful about knowing your children and knowing the complexity of their needs.
And sometimes challenging the official data, you know, we looked at the bigger picture, you know, those children weren't necessarily on a spreadsheet with a, you know, because grandma was in prison and that was impacting life, you know, that you can't record that anywhere, but we knew those broader disadvantages were affecting that child's ability to come with a mindset, you know, a steady brain that can activate prior knowledge, can't activate prior knowledge if they're anxious about something at home. All of that needed to be taken into consideration.
Okay, so how do we ensure the curriculum is at least as broad, deep and ambitious as the national curriculum?
Okay, so again, this goes back, and Mike's touched on this as well, about the uniqueness of your own school. So, I mean, we all teach the national curriculum, don't we? But it's about how do you make it specific to you, to your community, to your, every school's so different. You know, we all get measured the same way, but they're so different, you know, completely unique living things. They are living communities. So it's about how you make it special to you. So one of the things we did, for example, is one of the things I think you need to think about is what's your, as a leadership team, perhaps in a school, what's your belief, your purpose and values around what you want for your children? So not the national curriculum, but your children. What can you offer them? I think Ian Gilbert, if you've ever followed Independent Thinking Limited, Ian Gilbert's got a great phrase for this. So he talks about the fact that if I burst into your bedroom in the middle of the night and woke you up and said, what's the point of school? That the answer you blurt out would actually be your belief in what school is about. And it's about taking that and taking everybody's points of view into that. What do the children believe school's for? What do the parents you work with believe school is all about? What's the core purpose of school? And take that as the starting point. And then from a practical point of view, think about what's unique about your community and your physicality. Even have you got something geographically, locally that should be a massive part of your curriculum? You know, if you're near Stonehenge or you're near the coast or you're near a massive mountain that's really important, build those uniqueness things into your curriculum. Take things that are local, draw into, if you can, parental strengths. So when my children were at high school, we had parents who happened to work in the West End, and then they came and helped with production. That, you know, drawing out things that are strengths within your community and building that into your curriculum design, really important. Also, reach out to educational opportunities around you. So we used the local sixth form. We had art students come and do murals with our children, photography students that wanted to build portfolios. We had boys from the sixth form, local sixth form, came and gave guitar lessons for free. So there's lots of things that you can build into your curriculum and utilise that come from the local area, for example. We had a local private school nearby. They're often happy to help out. As part of their remit is to reach out to, so we'd go and watch their music events or their practice for rehearsals for their productions, and that exposed our children to, you know, the idea of theatre, the idea of music. So making things that are unique around you and utilising those to make the offer that you give them broad and ambitious. In terms of knowing your end points, obviously everybody's got their end points of the national curriculum, but I think a really massive part of making your curriculum broad, deep and ambitious is to invest in your staff and their professional development, and to treat them, without being condescending, but to treat them as professionals. So to make sure you've got a common language, a common pedagogical approach to teaching and learning, that they do understand what kind of theories of learning you believe in as a school, and that you invest in that training for them, because that will help you develop a broad and ambitious curriculum. Also, I'll give an example of that. For example, in my school where I'm currently co-chair, our head has set our staff off in groups to do learning inquiries and then feed that back to the other members of staff. So say year 5 are investigating how best to deliver spelling, for example. So that's all about investing in your staff, because that's at the core. Just like when you hear Alex talk, you can hear Alex has a massive grounding in understanding learning. And I think all staff need to share that same understanding for it to be ambitious.
Thank you. And I'm just going to move us on, because I know that you do curriculum planning and curriculum resources is absolutely the core of your business at Cornerstones now. Yeah. So do just share with us, and you've got a couple of minutes really just to share with us about how you approach curriculum planning at Cornerstones.
The slide isn't that easy to see, but that's about sequencing. I'll come on to that later. But basically, Cornerstones has been devising curriculum since about 2011, and it's always, as an organisation, followed the same 6 kind of principles of curriculum design. And they are: look at your principles and purpose. So what's your core values? That's what you start with. What entitlement and enrichment can you offer? So what can you build into the core expectation, which is what we've just discussed. Checking that you've got a breadth and balance, like Alex again has mentioned, you've got all the different subject areas, making sure that's balanced so that you can again assess against, and you've got just like Kevin Collins was talking about before he departed his post, that, you know, the arts are massively important. We shouldn't just be focusing on English and maths. What breadth and balance of subjects do you offer the children as they travel through your curriculum offer? That your teaching narrative, like I've just said, your staff should have a common teaching narrative approach. With our projects that we devise, we have a common approach of lessons that engage, so hook the brain in, activate prior knowledge, incite curiosity, lessons that then develop that skills and knowledge relating to that specific subject area. We call the next stage of learning innovate. That's about using and applying what you've learned. So maybe creating, making, doing something, or journaling, or answering a low stakes quiz, but showing me that you can apply your learning in a new way. And then the express stage of learning, which is about reflection and consolidation and sharing with others. So talking about your learning with others. So we have a clear pedagogical narrative to each of our sections of learning that teachers use. Resources are massively important to us. They have to be really clear, really specifically subject supporting. So not just generic, but really clearly thought about. So dual coding, really considered. Are the images and text accurate? Will they help learn? Will they not impact heavily on cognitive load? Will they make sure that is supported? So your quality of resources, so there's an equitable offer, that you've not got one resource in one classroom slightly not quite as good as the other one. That quality and equity of resource, really important. And finally, obviously, that the stage of review and evaluate. So what's gone well, and taking out and pruning what hasn't gone well, and refining what has. So that kind of common approach we've always done. And of course, evolve, because you have to then evolve your curriculum structure based on, well, we all know because of the pandemic, we've got to evolve it because there are things that may or may not have been missed at various levels, the macro level and the micro level. But sequencing has become obviously massively important, which I think is going to segue into that. So the image that we've got on the slide there is probably going to segue into the bit you've asked me to talk about, is what we're now looking at for Cornerstones 2022 curriculum. And the slide, although it's not that clear, is about how you can take one thread of an idea and make sure it's sequenced accurately within a year, but also across time. So as the child travels through the entire curriculum. So that's an example of how we've sat back and looked at climate, for example, and made sure we've got it covered both within different disciplines, different subject disciplines, geography, science, etc., and also that it's covered over time for a child. So there's a lot of sort of detail, obviously, that you have to do in the background to get that lovely sequenced curriculum. In the end, it's a lot of work. Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing us. That's really helpful. Alex, I'm going to come back to you, and I must apologise because I'm aware that you didn't get a chance to answer your sequencing knowledge question. So Alex, can I move us on to some of the questions we've had from participants? And if we get time, let's go back to the sequencing knowledge question, because I know you'd done some work on that. But we've got some questions that people have sent in before the webinar. So we've got 2 for you here, Alex. One about the 3 I's for effective curriculum design, and another one about literacy programs. So Alex, can I pass on to you for these 2 questions?
Yes. So taking the first one, the 3 I's for effective curriculum design, I would build on what Janet has already said. With regards to intent, the focus should be on your school's ambition for its pupils. Certainly thinking about the context of the school, and also what your community can offer. So Janet did mention about local links. So thinking about parents and their strengths, local businesses, local landmarks. It should be unique to the school, and you should be thinking really carefully about what your children's gaps are and how you want to overcome those through your curriculum. Going on to implementation, I would say it's always about privilege and thinking over the task. So we want deep learning. We should be working towards the delivery, should be developing mastery and leading to mastery. So we should always have that in mind when we're thinking about how we teach that curriculum. and what learning we want from that. But also thinking about the resources, the quality. Again, Janet mentioned this, the quality of the resources, the accuracy of the resources is absolutely key. And children should be presented with, you know, the best quality resources that are very sufficient to access that learning. Thinking about impact, I would say this is just about thinking what children have learned and checking whether they have learned it. So it's about that you set this intent out, you set out for each subject what you want the children to learn. This is a checking process of, has that actually been learned? Does the work in the books tell that story of that progress as well? And really clearly listening to children, observing what they can do on their own terms. Speaking to children is key to identify whether your curriculums have an impact on them in the long term.
That's helpful, thank you. And the second question about literacy, I know we're moving through these at a pace now, but if you can give us some responses to that, that would be great.
Okay, so designing a literacy programme and thinking again about identifying gaps, I would say this is again about what Janet was saying about curriculums. You should be identifying that core knowledge that threads through a curriculum. So when you're thinking about what should we teach and prioritise when we know we've missed things or that things may have not been taught during the pandemic, we should be selecting that most powerful, versatile, and the word is versatile, knowledge that can be used across the units of study within a subject or cross-curricular aspects, and making sure that we teach those because they'll need revisit or they'll be revisited. So identifying those within your curriculum and making sure they are taught and revisited. Identify lessons where you can recap the powerful knowledge that you want those children to have, that they initially encountered during remote education, but that you know is absolutely key for the next stage. There's a lot around this knowledge, awareness of the concepts, but there are some concepts that are classed as threshold concepts that will take you to the next point of learning. And it's identifying those within the curriculum and prioritising those in whatever subject, but in particular with literacy. Again, I would say it is careful planning and sequencing, using those low stakes assessments to identify and address those gaps and plan for it. But if you're thinking about primary schools and prioritising within the literacy curriculum, we've obviously got to think about that aspect of phonics and decoding and making sure that is taught well and that there is sufficient time for the reading and writing, including phonics and spelling.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate it. Mike, I'm going to pass this on to you. And we've got questions about how we can evidence progress and how we squeeze in all the new recommendations to build a coherent and engaging curriculum. Over to you.
Well, I could spend a day on both of those, but I'll start with evidencing progress. So let me start with the question really is, why on earth should children love reading? Why should they have a lifelong love of reading? I mean, how many people on this call are going to immediately jump off the call, go home, start reading books voraciously because they love reading? So let's start with asking yourself that question. Why should children love reading? That's your starting point for a judgment around progress. That's your starting point for defining what reading is actually about. I can look at your phonics score and I can judge outcomes. I can look at your Key Stage 2 data. I can judge your outcome. I can look at your GLD and judge your outcome. But how many schools have a working definition of what the love of reading looks like, sounds like, feels like, and the behaviours that children demonstrate? One of the real problems with the monitoring of progress in schools is far too often it is a monitoring of compliance. And the sophistication of our middle leaders has got to be better. So judging the planning for reading tells you that someone's planned for it. Judging a lesson where someone delivers a reading lesson tells you someone's delivering it. Judging something written in a book tells you that they've done an activity. You cannot judge progress from any of those activities. So they're a waste of your time, all right? And, you know, it's fine to do it, but you need a working definition of what a good reader who loves reading in year 3 looks like. And it isn't, we've redone the library. That's what love of reading does. It isn't that we've bought a load of really interesting text. Okay, great, well done. It isn't that we've got lots of people coming in to talk about reading. Okay. Do children pick up books and do they want to read them? Can you see whether children love reading and they read more from year 3 to year 4? Has reading got social cachet in your schools? How do you evidence that? So progress is much more finely defined and you can apply that to any subject. Why should be a long time lover of PE? I mean, I don't, but it's necessary. So how would you judge progress in that? Well, you've got to have a really working definition about what children do, say, think, demonstrate, and choose to do. And that's how you have your baseline. But your baseline begins with a really good definition of what a great historian would look like in your school, what a great geographer would look like in your school. What does a voracious child who loves reading look like, sound like, and say in year 4? And is your monitoring sophisticated enough to pick that up, or is it just too hard? So let's just look at the books.
That's very clear and very challenging, Mike. I wouldn't expect anything less, I have to say, but thank you for that. Is there anything else that you want to add around how we squeeze in the recommendations?
Again, I think it goes back to you have to make deliberate, carefully considered decisions for your school and have a really clear definition about what your subjects look like. So actually, what people look at when they're doing the curriculum is activity. So they think to themselves, well, I've got to do 16 science lessons on forces. But actually what really matters is, do they understand forces? Doesn't matter how many lessons you do on it, it matters that they understand it. So having a really clear, deliberately, properly discussed working definition about what success in each subject looks like is crucial to that. And then give it the time it needs, not the time you've always given it. And I think you look for activity and anything that adds additional value. What can be automated, i.e. times tables can be automated. What can you do outside of the normal day? Yeah, what can you do with a tutor? What can you do with additional work? Thinking to yourself, what can we usefully do? And that which can be automated needs to be separated, and having really clear working definitions for your school about what success across a curriculum looks like. And remember, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint.
Thank you, Mike. Again, kind of really practical and very challenging. We appreciate it. Thank you. Janet, I'm going to move back onto you. We've already had a discussion in part about how to ensure gaps from previous learning are filled. And we've had how to track and monitor versus planned curriculum, or rather, if you can look at as well, how to track and monitor actual versus planned curriculum coverage. And we are kind of quite close to the wall with time, which I know everybody's aware of. But
be quick.
Do your best, Janet. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's like we've just said there, Mike's just touched on both of these, I think, really. Obviously, in order to track and monitor, you have to have a clearly planned curriculum in the first place. Otherwise, how do you track it? So again, you have to be very clear about what you're expecting to happen when, in order to check whether it's happened. Gaps, I think there's 2 levels of that, isn't there? There's lots of teachers, people were talking to me last night at a staff training I did about the fact we've not covered the Greeks, you know, and we need to make sure that gets covered. Well, that's all very well, but what you have to actually ask yourself is, have we developed these children as historians, and does that matter whether we do the Greeks for a term or a day? Really, it's about what are the knowledge and skills as historians they've missed. And I think that's often a challenge we find when we advise schools on curriculum. They're still very obsessed with coverage, a lot, not everybody, but there is a lot of obsession with coverage as opposed to that depth of learning, I think. So I think it is, you've got to know what you plan to deliver in order to find a gap, because that's obvious. We would say from a Cornerstones point of view, you can click a button on the system to help you do that, but that's not a generic tool for everybody to use. But you do have to be clear about what they've missed. And you have to decide not only at the macro level what they've missed potentially, but at the individual level. So again, if you don't know what a reader, historian, musician looks like in your school and what skills and knowledge they should have, then how do you fill those gaps? So it's like chicken and egg, really. You've got to know what you expect to happen in order to fill it. And you have to decide, are you filling a macro gap at the curriculum level, or are you filling a micro gap at the child level? And you need to do both. And it's again about making those decisions for your school, for yourself, for your curriculum structure, which has to be there in the first place.
That's great. Thank you so much. Alex, I'm just going to come back and we've got about 2 minutes, if you can help us out with this one, to your question about the sequencing of knowledge. If so, and please just give us a couple of minutes about that. That would be great.
Okay. So I think this is about, I mean, the whole point again around this, the focus of this has come again from the inspection framework. It's obviously common sense, but actually it's made us look at it again. And that's why the Cornerstones is looking at this again, because for too long have children been taught fragmented pieces of knowledge, and it needs to be really clear what that sequencing. So how we do that, again, it's first understanding, the core knowledge, the disciplinary knowledge, the procedural knowledge of the subject that you want to actually teach children and you want them to gain from that. Thinking carefully about some of those key concepts that will thread right through your curriculum that you want to build on. Making sure that your teachers are aware, not just leaders designing a curriculum. I think this is key. We can plan a curriculum, doesn't mean it's being delivered in the right way. So you might plan a sequence of learning across the whole primary phase, and actually if teachers don't know what came before, what's coming after, and they can't then speak to the children about what came before and what's coming after, they can't tap into that prior knowledge. So it's absolutely key that we spend time investing in teacher subject knowledge of sequencing and progression to make sure that they can enact that within the classroom. If teachers do not know the sequence of knowledge and what came before and after across the curriculum, they definitely won't talk about it with children. Then children won't know why they are learning this and how it connects to something before or something that's coming after. So there needs to be a strong focus on that. So it's identifying what's core knowledge, disciplinary knowledge, procedural, what you want them to know how to do, making sure that that those key concepts are mapped across the curriculum and that teachers are aware of them so that they can make sure children are aware of them and make all those connections and build that schematic that you want. That's probably what I'd say in 2 minutes about that.
Thank you very much. That was very clear and very helpful. We've got no live questions that have come in today, which is probably just as well because we're kind of very up against it. But we've heard some great strategies for designing a meaningful recovery curriculum. We've had some really great questions that people have put in before today. And it's very exciting always to be able to be in a situation where the education community are sharing their collective learning in a generous and timely way. So thank you to our panel members for that. Janet, thank you so much for sharing the work that you're doing currently at Cornerstones, but also your kind of personal and very practical experiences in school as well, and some of the work that you've done there. Alex, you've shared really candidly, actually, and very clearly about the work that you're doing with the teachers and staff that you lead, and the work that you do across the Northwest, which I know is really important to you. So thank you for that. Mike, as ever, you've given us the challenge, which we always enjoy, and actually cutting to the chase, really, and given us very clear messages about you do all this activity, but so what? The question is actually, what's the impact? So yeah, again, you've focused our minds very clearly on that. So I'd like to thank you all for your presentations today and the preparation that I know you've put into that, and for the really sensible approaches that you've talked through as well. We'll follow this webinar up with a blog, which we always do, and we will link any resources that people have referred to today. We'll also be posting a recording of the webinar on YouTube. So if you've got colleagues who weren't able to join us today, who you think would really enjoy this session, then do please tell them about the recording. I'd like to thank the team rather behind the scenes here at Zen Educate. We've got Andrew and Ross, who you can't see, but believe you me, they've put lots of work in today and made sure that tech is on our side and made sure that things run smoothly. So thanks to them. And we'd love to hear your feedback from this event. It's really important to us that we hear feedback and it helps us improve. Okay, so we're always really keen to hear from you. You can email us, or you can send us a text, or you can DM us on Twitter. Any of those things is great. So you can email us at support@zeneducate.com, and you can follow us on socials, which I'm just going to show you, which are here. Okay, so you can find us on any of those social channels, and we'd love to hear from you. We really would. And we're also always really interested to hear what else you'd like us to carry out a webinar on, what other things you're really keen to hear about, what you're concerned about, what you're excited about. Those are the sorts of things we want to hear about. So the last thing it leaves me to do is just to say thank you to all of our panel for joining us today. Thank you for all your hard work. Is there any one last thing that you'd like to say? I'm just going to give everybody a moment to say, like, if you wanted people to remember one thing you'd said today. Janet, what's your one thing that you'd like people to remember from today?
Focus on your principles and purpose before anything else. What you're there for, what's learning, what's school for.
Brilliant. Principles and purpose, what's school for? Alex, what would be your number one that you just like people to go away with and remember?
I think I would say be kind to yourself. Everybody's experience has been very different in this, and actually we need to remember we're humans, and our moral purpose of being educators comes first and foremost, and just to be clear that every child's starting points will be different, and stay together as a community with that, really.
Thank you. No, that's great. And Mike, one last comment from you. What do you want people most to remember about what you said today?
Be aware of the accountability framework, but don't let that be the driver for school improvement. What matters is what matters to you, your community, and your children, and be confident in talking about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you all so much for joining in. Thank you so much for your preparation. Thank you, everybody who's been here today. We hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.